Okay, so thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. My name's Rose, and I am a teacher, trainer, and a CELTA tutor. I'm actually based here in Liverpool, but if you're from Liverpool, you will very quickly realise I'm not from Liverpool. I love this city to bits, so I'm very happy to be here and to welcome you up here. So although I do a lot of work in the region of the northwest of England, I actually work internationally as well, and I set up a couple of years ago this website, Pop-Up Teacher Trainer, because I sort of pop up all over the place. So if you're interested in a little bit more finding out what I do, check that out. So much of my training and teacher development work that I do is a reflection on my own experience of my own teaching practice, both present and past. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is absolutely no different. It's very much rooted in my own classroom experience. And it's as relevant now, I hope, as when it was when I first qualified back in 2004. So back then, as a fresh-faced graduate off my Trinity Cert course, at the age of 18, I was totally overwhelmed by the seemingly endless possibilities facing me in terms of planning and delivering lessons. And this had a hugely detrimental impact on my teaching ability, and I think resulted in a really disproportionate ratio of time spent planning to lesson delivery. And I'd stay up all night long, worrying about what I was going to teach and what decisions I had to make about planning. To the point where I got so stressed out and so exhausted, at the end of my very first summer teaching, I swore I would never set foot in an EFL classroom again. Fast forward 14 years, and now, as a teacher trainer and a mentor, I've witnessed exactly the same thing happening with some of the teachers that I'm working with, especially pre-service early career teachers. But now also, as a more experienced teacher, I'm also witnessing and experiencing firsthand myself the exact opposite, the sort of day-to-day routine of repeating tried and tested planning and teaching decisions with very, very predictable outcomes. So I'd like to introduce a couple of terms here. I don't know if you've come across these before. The first one is analysis paralysis, which rolls off the tongue nicely. And this is what I'm describing when you're faced with too many decisions, too many possible options, too many choices. We simply become completely paralyzed and unable to actually follow any particular course of action. Decision-making also tires us, and decision fatigue, as this is commonly known, is the idea that the greater the number of decisions that we have to make in a particular day, the more likely the quality of our decision-making is to deteriorate. And as teachers, we are creatures of habit. Habits save us time. They save us kind of wasting this cognitive energy on processes that we don't need to. But we also need to use this brain power elsewhere. And so habits can be a good thing, but we also need to be a little bit careful because they can make our teaching very stale and repetitive. Planning and teaching are decision-rich activities, and our brains have a limited capacity to make effective decisions. So it's really interesting then that in education globally and in the field of ELT, there's a general trend towards learner autonomy and putting the onus of decision-making and putting this onto the learner. So here are just a handful of the books that have been written on the subject of learner autonomy in recent years. This growing interest in learner autonomy and language education has led to a parallel trend in autonomous, bottom-up teacher development. For many teachers, an element of choice is integral to professional development. However, I would argue that too much choice can actually have a really detrimental impact on teachers' workload, levels of stress, and decision-making abilities. And this is often the case with pre-service and early career teachers. So in this presentation, I'm going to argue the case for an alternative approach, and I'm going to talk about the application of constraints on teaching and planning. And I think this actually can go hand in hand with learner autonomy. It doesn't have to be something that's mutually exclusive. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, it's not a magic pill, because there aren't any, but it is a very simple and I think very effective, easily applicable idea, concept for teacher development. It's also not an original idea of mine. I can't claim that. It's basically what's led up to this particular presentation is a few years ago I read an article in IATEFL Voices by Greg Goebel, who I think was teaching for British Council Madrid at the time, and this was the edition of the magazine 217, if anyone wants to look it up. It's an article called Freedom in Constraint, and it inspired me, and that's what led to this talk. So I'm going to hand over to you very, very quickly for about a minute, and I'd like you to just discuss what you think or what you understand. What does the term constraint mean to you? So if you just want to talk for a minute to the person next to you, very generally, not necessarily in teaching terms, what does the term constraint mean to you? Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Okay, so for me, a constraint is something that controls what you do by keeping you within particular limits. It's something that limits the range of your personal actions or freedom. And I need to be a little bit careful here to clarify that although I've got a picture of handcuffs up on the board, I'm talking about constraints and not restraints. So however much you might want to tie up the teachers in your classroom or your students, and that's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is the application of sentences to your planning and teaching practices that tend to begin with the words only or no. So you might say, in my next lesson, no course books, if you're a teacher that uses a course book all the time. Or you might say, only authentic materials. And see what impact adopting this limitation has on your teaching. And it suddenly occurred to me this morning, actually, that in framing the limitation as a no or an only statement, that is a constraint in itself. But it seems to work quite well, and I like that. So for many of you, I don't know what you just talked about, but constraint might have a negative connotation. But if you think about it, we actually use and apply constraints in life and across society all the time. So take dieting, for example, or self-imposed dietary restrictions, like veganuary, which a lot of people attempted this year in the UK as a New Year's resolution. Or app blockers, like freedom, which reduce distractions and help us improve our focus. Or wearing a uniform to reduce that critical dilemma, what should I wear to work this morning? Or what should I wear to IATEFL this morning? And the application of constraint also has a really interesting history in artistic endeavor. So like many commissioned pieces of art, the Renaissance most famous sculpture of David, for example, was forged out of constraints. Michelangelo was hired to complete the statue in 1501 on the understanding, it was actually written into his contract, that he completed it within 2 years. So working within those time limits, he created that magnificent piece of work that we know so well today. Architects also work within the constraints of their brief and the limitations of space and resources available to them. And this picture shows Phil Hansen, who is a pointillist artist, which is a kind of art you draw with dots. And after many years of drawing these dots, creating amazing pieces of artwork with dots, he actually developed a tremor in his arm. In a really inspiring TED talk, and I strongly recommend you look this one up, it's called The Power of Constraints. He describes how over several years he came to embrace the shake And he went on to create many, many pieces of work using alternative means, such as his feet or karate chops. In film, in the late 1990s, the world of ELT suddenly became intensely aware of the filmmaking movement known as Dogme 95. And Danish directors Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg created films with no special effects and no technology, what they called vows of chastity. And this idea, of course, was taken up by Scott Thornbury in the development of Dogme ELT. And of course, when you think about it, we also use constraints in language learning. We impose constraints with our students all the time. We ask them to complete guided or controlled practice activities with a limited number of possible responses. And in freer activities, we scaffold tasks by including content or language prompts, providing time limits for speaking, reading, or writing. And in mingles, we might limit the number of people that we want our students to speak to. The list is endless. So why use constraints? Why actually make our lives more difficult than we need to? You might be thinking this at this point. Well, I think there's loads of benefits, but I've stewed it down to the following 4. The first is that I think constraints can protect us. And I say us because I mean they can protect teachers against themselves. And we do need this sometimes. I talked about myself as an early career teacher. I needed protection against over-planning and the anxiety and stress that caused, the tiredness. Procrastination might be a problem that you suffer from. If you have the time, you will fill it. Students also need protection from teachers over enthusiastic use of the interactive whiteboard, perhaps. That might be you. Overuse of photocopied materials, reliance on the course book, too much TTT. So constraints can protect. They can also support by providing a really clear structure or framework which teachers can work within. Limiting freedom can actually result in confidence building and support better decision making. They can also prepare, future-proof us for future scenarios. The classroom with no whiteboard, the lesson you might have to teach during a power cut, the jammed photocopier. Many of us are fortunate to teach in times of comfort, and this is the point at which we need to push our limits, not in those last-minute moments of panic. We've all been there, though, haven't we? And finally, and this is the big one for me, I think constraints can really challenge us as teachers. I think they can force us to problem solve creatively. Overcoming barriers can lead to innovation, and embracing limitation, whether it's self-imposed or imposed by a trainer or a manager, or even other factors outside of our control that I've just described, can really drive creativity. Phil Hansen, the artist that I just mentioned, describes this as the ultimate limitation becoming the ultimate liberation. So it's worth noting that we all actually teach already within certain constraints. And one of the great strengths of this idea, I think, is that it can be universally applied. It's so simple. Whether your classroom looks like this, or like this. The idea is not context-specific. It is, however, highly individual, and the constraints you choose to apply will likely be very, very different to the teacher sitting next to you. And I'm going to come back to this point later about how to choose your constraints. So let's get concrete and practical, shall we? I think there are 3 aspects of teaching that I've identified that we can limit. Those are the 3: time, materials, and language. And I'm going to take a look at each in turn and give you lots of examples about what you can do with this. So let's look at time, first of all. In an article I wrote in 2015 in the Modern English Teacher magazine, I described what I called the planning paradox. And this is the priority that ELT teacher training has long given to the writing of formal lesson plans with aims and interaction patterns and so on, over real-life lesson planning. So in the article, I argue the case for training teachers in some informal lesson planning And on most of my recent CELTA courses, I've tried to incorporate this by delivering an input session with my trainees on planning for real life. So on the last couple of courses, I've done an activity a bit like this, where I've provided a context, such as a job interview task, and I've asked the trainees to team plan a lesson, usually present perfect, past simple. That's the one that's always in the job interviews, isn't it? And I've given them maybe 5 minutes in which to do this. And they have to work together and come up with the best lesson plan that they can do, given the materials in that amount of time. Then might say, you've got a standby lesson, and you've got 2 minutes in which to plan it. Here's the material. What can you do? What can you come up with? So creating a context and a time limit, and allowing them to practice their planning within these very, very restricted time limits. And this can be reduced or increased, as you like. I call this pyramid planning. And obviously in my CELTA courses, I have to do it as a trial run in an input session. I can't actually do this with their teaching practice. But if you are a practicing teacher, there's no reason why you can't do this with your classes. So that's one constraint we can put on our planning. What other time constraints can we think of? Well, I've come up with a few. Perhaps you could think about a 60-minute wrap around your lessons, and you can play with the ratio of how much time you're going to spend before and after. So it could be 30 minutes planning, 30 minutes reflection, or the next lesson it could be 15 minutes planning, 45 minutes reflection, and just playing around with that ratio. You could do no planning less than a week before the lesson. If you're a last-minute planner, you could change that up by forcing yourself to plan early. You could do no planning at all. In class, and this is again something I do with my CELTA trainees a lot, because their warmers, their lead-ins tend to go on forever, I limit them to 2 minutes. If teacher talking time is a problem for you, you could say, I'm only going to have 1-minute plenary stages so that teacher-centeredness of my lesson is reduced. Or if there's a particular aspect of your teaching that you feel is lacking, or something that the students need more of, such as pronunciation, you could say, I'm going to spend no less than 15 minutes on pron in my lessons, or in my next lesson. So those are just a few ideas. Let's move on to materials. I think this perhaps is the most obvious aspect of our practice to limit. When I was working as a manager in an office in Cairo in Egypt, I set up a regular weekly email that challenged teachers to teach a lesson or a lesson stage or segment around a single object. These weekly emails became known as teaching with. So it might be teaching with a ball, teaching with dice, teaching with your lunchbox. It became hugely popular. So what happened was I sent out the email at the beginning of the week, and I invited teachers to contribute ideas of what they would do with these objects. And these emails would come flying back to me. I'd compile them into something that looked like this. This was the one for straws, plastic straws. And you can see the kind of creativity that teachers came up with in terms of thinking about how they could use these with particularly their young learners. What other material constraints could we impose? So I've just mentioned basing a lesson around only one object. You could use no course book if you are a teacher who relies on a course book a lot, or you could use only the course book. Other publications are available. You could use only one side of A4 paper. Again, this is a good one for CELTAs because CELTA trainees can get very enthusiastic about photocopying. You could use no text, only visuals. Only poems. Only songs or song lyrics. Only 5 slides if you are a teacher who uses PowerPoint. No tech, only tech. Only student-generated texts. I quite like that one. This is something I tried this term, no coloured boardwork, or you could try no boardwork at all. And this made me really think about how I was representing and highlighting particular aspects of language to my students. You could try only student boardwork, no materials at all. Only authentic materials. You could try, as in the picture here, only using a WhatsApp message that you've received in the last 24 hours. And this was one I did with my cousin's proposal. You could use materials that you've recorded only with your colleagues. And again, this is a picture of Mike, one of my colleagues, who very kindly described how he met his partner, which I recorded and then used in class. You could use only live listening materials that you record on your phone in the lesson and then play back to students to listen to again. Or one I really want to try, more of next term, only materials from sources you would never read or watch yourself, such as The Sun, Match of the Day, or Bridal Guide. So, lots of ideas. I really think the sky's the limit with materials. There's so much you could do with this. So finally, let's move on to language. This was a class I taught recently, and I'd like you to play you a little extract, and I want to see if you can guess what the constraint was. Any guesses? Only L1, no English for part of the lesson. Yeah, exactly. So this was an activity where they were talking about their own countries and their own culture, and I separated them into L1 groups. Worked really, really well. It actually generated a lot more motivation in the task. So only L1 for part of the lesson. Another issue, I've brainstormed a lot of these with colleagues, and one of them suggested they had a particular problem with students not responding when they ask questions. So if this is a problem that you face, this is one for you. Only continue the lesson after all the students have responded somehow, whether it's in writing or speaking. Another language constraint, no on-the-spot error correction, or no delayed error correction, depending on which one you do more of, perhaps. No negative feedback. No praise. Tricky one. You could only board emergent language and nothing that you've planned. You could focus only on accuracy or only on fluency for a lesson. No grammar. Replace that with vocabulary, functional language. If you don't already do this, you could only board language in chunks. In terms of correction for language, only silent correction using the phonemic chart for a lesson. See what that does to your teaching. Or only plan a lesson in a second language if you speak a second language. I think this is a really interesting one, and I just want to show you an example of this. You start to think differently about the language you're teaching. So this is an example of a colleague of mine who planned a lesson on comparatives in Arabic, because that's the language that she's learning. Okay, so I've given you some examples. Let's talk about implementation now. How are we actually going to systematically implement this, whether we're teachers, trainers, or managers? I think there's a few things to think about. So the first thing, as I mentioned earlier, is are you going to trial run this in an input session? Is it something that you want to do in the safety of an input session, or is it something you want to actually apply to your teaching straight off? Is it something that you as a teacher are going to impose upon your own teaching, or in your institution, could you impose it as a trainer on the teachers you're working with? or the managers could have a week where you impose constraints on teachers to see what they can do with it. How long are you going to do it for? It could be a segment of a lesson, as I described earlier, part of a lesson, one lesson, a series of lessons, a term, several terms. I think depending on the constraint, you can do as little or as much of this as you like. Recording it, obviously, is really important, and the reflection on what you're doing is is critical. So I think you need to think in advance about how are you going to observe what you are doing and the results that you get. So you can do this through self-observation. Obviously, there are different ways we can record our own lessons, whether it's just note-taking and reflection afterwards, or recording part of the lesson on your phone. Or it could be you ask a peer observer to come in and observe the lesson for you, or a trainer. And again, like I said, I think this is something that could be done universally. So whether or not you are teaching on your own in a very remote context where you don't have access face-to-face with other colleagues, or if you're in a teacher's room and you've got a huge resource of a kind of human resource there, you could do this on your own or in collaboration with other teachers. And I said I'd come back to how to choose constraints, and that's sort of one of the last things I want to talk about today. There's many different ways that you could come to the particular constraints that you want to apply. It could be that you've been to a training session that really inspired you, and you think, oh, I really want to try that. It might be that you've read an article or you've read something online, and that is the impetus for choosing that particular constraint. It could be feedback from students, it could be feedback from a peer observer or feedback from a manager. It could be a particular event, and I don't mean an event that you went to, I mean a particular classroom event. Maybe something went wrong in class, and as a result, you could apply the constraint to see how you could deal with it better or differently next time. Or it could just be a very informal discussion that you have with colleagues. So these are just a few ideas. So hopefully I've given you a bit of food for thought. I'm going to put up now a slide with all of the ideas that I've just talked about. So if you want to grab that one, you can. I really do think there are endless possibilities with this, and I'd like to continue the conversation beyond this presentation. There might be some ideas that you like here. There might be some you hate. But what I want to do is challenge you now to choose one that you think is going to be really difficult and do it on Monday morning. And beyond this session, I've also created a Padlet. I'd really like to see what creative ideas you can come up with. So please go to this link and add to it, and let's see what constraints we can think of collectively as an IATEFL session. And if you can, color code it using the 3 colors that I've put at the bottom of this slide. Okay, so to sum up, I think applying constraints to your teaching should be an experimental process, aimed to push you out of your comfort zone and challenge you, whether you're newly qualified or have years of experience. And that means that the constraints that you apply don't need to be permanent, and if you and your students hate it, don't do it again, move on. If you or your students love it, repeat it again and again for even better results. Secondly, I think the practice of applying constraints to your teaching should be inherently simple and doable. I suggest single tasking on this rather than multitasking. I think applying one constraint at a time is probably the best way to go for the best results. See what happens. And finally, I think it should be disruptive. If you find yourself choosing the easy option, then you're probably not doing this right. And this is about testing your limits. You should choose something that is completely new and different for you and makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And bear in mind, this is totally different from teacher to teacher. So you do not have to compare yourself with someone else in your teacher's room. This is not a competition. So hopefully this presentation's given you some food for thought and highlighted how the simple act of tying teachers' hands can be a really effective, low-cost developmental tool that can yield unexpectedly favourable results. Thank you very much for listening. Please share and add to that Padlet, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you.